First, I'd like to introduce Ronan Donovan. He is an apple that did not fall far from the tree. His father, I've gotten to know recently in the last couple of years, and they both care deeply for the environment. And Ronan, a wildlife biologist and National Geographic Fellow, has been on the front lines helping the world see through his perspective and his lens the intimate connection we have with the natural world around us. And we're going to enjoy his presentation. Our second speaker, Jon Leibowitz, I had the distinct pleasure of interviewing him and filming him in our 2021 film that was released as an environmental documentary. Jon is one of the few souls that I actually know who practices what he preaches. He lives a life with minimal economic and ecological footprint. He really is a true environmentalist. He's dedicated his life to protecting and preserving the natural world, and he's an expert in rewilding. So you'll learn about that tonight as well. Our third speaker this past month, just north of where we are sitting today, along the Lyme and Orford town borders, Jon Leibowitz, the CEO of Northeast Wilderness Trust, worked diligently to close on and protect 2,000 acres of marvelous wilderness. And I've walked it with a few folks. And that adds to the 100,000 acres that the trust has already safeguarded over the past decade or so. Through Jon's intimate understanding of conservation law, his varied relationships with agencies, entities, and donors, he and the trust are able to permanently establish and protect the much needed wilderness to support and bring results and bring life to much of Jon and Ronan's work. So we're excited to have all three of these guys. They're tremendous. It's going to be a great presentation, I'm sure, and we'll learn what rewilding exactly is and how it has and can profoundly and positively transform the environment. I hope they can help clarify and lift the fog that surrounds the term land conservation. There's so many different permutations of it, and leave us with a deeper appreciation for living in balance with the natural world around us. So welcome to you three, and I guess, how do you want to do it, Jon? Just have them all sit up here, or one at a time, or?
You can all sit up there.
So why don't you all come up here and we'll start the presentation.
No, we should be blocking the screen.
Okay, so whoever's first.
I'll just start first.
Okay, welcome, Ronan.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Dad, for bringing us all here together and for this invitation. I get nervous when I speak in this building specifically, and that's because when I was 13, I was arrested right over there at the four-way stop sign, and that set me on this path of, I got 2 felonies. They found out about the 2 things that I did, and I got sent away to wilderness. I was stealing things. Sorry if you had something stolen out of your car. 1995. But it was an important time for me, and it was something that my father and my mother were very instrumental in, was sending me to a wild place to get healed, to change. And I think that's going to be my contribution to this discussion, at least in this panel, is this idea of, like, we talk about rewilding landscapes, but there's also this need, I feel, and others do, that we need to rewild ourselves, parts of ourselves, and remember our connection to the natural world. And so as was mentioned, I work in storytelling, mostly visual storytelling and written storytelling, and I work on stories around conservation. And this image that I took in Rwanda between Volcanoes National Park and the human community is an image that I focus on in my thought process often, around this division between what we think of as wild lands and kind of the human-dominated world, the modern world. And I think of this image in the context of, this is both a physical, geographical boundary that we have created in the modern world, but it's also, I think of it as like a psychological boundary, that we all have these wild, forested jungle places. Maybe there's a gorilla that lives in the deep corners of our psyche, and then we have this domesticated version that is trying to be neat and trying to be tidy. And those 2 things, they bump up against each other in kind of this friction. And the images that I create through my work focuses around that that division between these places. Let me go back. Here we go. Okay. So this is a global map looking at these places that are kind of large wild areas, large tracts of land that are considered wild, untamed, potentially haven't been developed by modern humans in the last few thousand years. And there's an interesting look when we go to, if this works correctly, we look at global population densities. Okay, so dark green is wildlands. Basically, white is places where people are not in the modern context. So it's just reiterating kind of that line between where humans are and where humans are not, and the idea that wildlands are those places where we are not. And I think we can start to blend those places a bit more as humans have in the past. And I think that there's this idea around, like, we're rushing away from this wild place in terms of our land, our use, our homes, where we live, and we're rushing towards this modern world with technology kind of at the helm, but we don't fully understand either of those places. Like, none of us in the modern context fully understand what it would be like to be a wild human in the sense of living as the way that we evolved for tens of thousands of years. And we don't fully understand what the future, the technologically driven future, is going to look like. And we're kept kind of in this uncomfortable, restless middle zone. Like, we don't really know what to do in some cases, like what to conserve, what not to conserve. And I think that my approach to these conversations is around, I wish people would understand that, like, this is a big experiment that we are all undertaking together, this idea of modern living on the landscape in the way that we do. And we're living kind of in that middle zone where we haven't quite fully stepped into one or the other. And if we approach those conversations around this idea of, okay, this hasn't actually happened before, this isn't the way things have always been, and then we begin these conversations, I think it's a way to start that dialogue in a refreshing way. And so I bring in kind of heartbeats to these conversations through wildlife, through, this is a chimpanzee story that I did for National Geographic magazine. And then I also focus on that tension point where humans and chimps are colliding in these very kind of intense ways, where there's resource competition. We and chimpanzees are both these territorial social apes. And these are very challenging situations. This image we saw earlier, this is the mountain gorilla situation. This is the family mountain gorillas. And there's also this line between their world and the human world that gets blurred. And that there isn't actually this idea of separation, that we are connected in that way. I grew up here, as I mentioned, in Norwich, born and raised. And I live now in Montana, in a place that has wildlands in a different way than we have here. There's large tracts of places like Yellowstone, where we have millions of acres. The greater Yellowstone ecosystem is about 20 million acres. And it's land that hasn't been plowed, hasn't been cultivated, much of it hasn't been logged. And there's a sense of being in wild spaces that I think we can all relate to around this idea of, like, I think of wild spaces as regulated nervous systems in the wild world. And we, as humans, when we're around another person, another human that has a regulated nervous system, we feel calm, we feel relaxed, there's a safety involved in that. I feel that same way in these wild places in parts all around the world. But I chose to live in Montana, having grown up here in the East, and it's a place that holds many of those wild regulated nervous systems. You know, we think of words like biodiversity and why that's important. Essentially, it makes a system more resilient to change, more resilient to climate change or disturbance. And those are these regulated nervous system landscapes that have been in some sort of balanced state for tens of thousands of years. Montana is diverse in its landscapes. We have these big prairie landscapes, and then we also have those big mountain landscapes that I mentioned earlier. Obviously, we have large, free-ranging animals in certain contexts. Buffalo are an animal that can range freely in certain parts of the state, a little bit out of West Yellowstone, the western part of Yellowstone National Park, but to the north, they can't roam free. They are corralled and they are shipped off to slaughter. These are wild national mammals of our country, but they still don't have the freedom to roam in that sense of being purely wild. So that relationship between humans and the wild world is still very much unfolding, even in a place like Montana that has a lot of wildness. This is an animal that I spend a lot of time with and a lot of time storytelling about, thinking about. These are gray wolves in Yellowstone. And I've come to think about wolves as these teachers for the humans. If we're in conflict with the natural world or with a specific animal, I feel like we're actually in conflict with ourselves. There's a great Rachel Carson quote around man is part of nature, and his war against nature is inevitably a war against himself. So if we are animals, we're part of the natural world, and we're in conflict with it, whether it be deer browsing our garden or it be wolves bumping up against the livestock and taking sheep or taking cattle, then that's actually a opportunity for us to think differently and think more creatively about what are we not seeing here in this relationship? What can we learn from these animals? And a place where I've spent a significant amount of time is the Canadian High Arctic. And it's a place that on that global map of human population is white in terms of not very many people that live in this part of the world. This is an island called Ellesmere Island. It's the furthest northern landmass you can go in Canada. There's one human habitation on the very southern tip of the island. It's about 150 people that live there, and they're mainland indigenous people that moved from Quebec province to this island in like the 1950s as part of the imperialist rule of that country. And so I go there to see wolves and to understand kind of a different relationship to wolves, one that's not rooted in that conflict narrative. So it's this idea of wildness around a place where humans are not, and therefore there's an access and a proximity and an understanding to these animals that is one that doesn't have that conflict narrative rooted in this. And this is much of what I thought of as wolves when I was younger, was kind of the fearful narratives that we get through our stories and fairy tales. And when you spend time with them, and these are family of wolves that I've spent time with on and off for about 10 years, and this is a scene that would happen very often, and this is a sleeping family of wolves that we don't very often get to see, these kind of quieter moments. And this is spending time with them months and months at a time, and they become relaxed. And this is me just 20 feet away taking pictures of them while they're sleeping. They certainly know I'm there. There's no hiding from them in the tundra. But it is kind of reimagining that relationship to the natural world and an animal like wolves that we used to have all through New England, and we could perhaps have in the future. This is just I'm going to share a story from being up there in the Arctic. This is just from a couple years ago, just a camp that I set up. I was up there by myself for a couple weeks, set up a little spike camp, and got woken up by some of the foxes. And then this is a camera that I set up on a carcass that shows kind of the playful side of wolves. I stole the camera. It's one of the things I like to play is keep away. Inside of a wolf mouth. This is a lot of what they would do with me was they would try to steal stuff. They would try to come in and grab my bag, grab a camera, and sometimes they were successful, sometimes they were not. This next video kind of shows some of the proximity. This was I was waking up from a nap and heard this wolf coming by, and she was trying to steal that corner of my pad. There's some sound if it's working. She just wants to grab the corner of the sleeping pad there. That's her main goal. It's a wolf I've known for a while, so I understand this behavior.
It does look like tofu.
It does look, yeah. That's their main diet is tofu. It translates. She's very persistent, and I'm kind of talking to her here, telling her, don't do it, leave it. And she eventually moves off and understand that this was not something that she'd be able to get.
Did you find the kill she'd been eaten on?
Sorry?
Did you find the kill?
Yeah, you can see some of the blood in her nose. Yeah, she was at a muskox carcass. That's the main food that they eat there.
Yeah.
Big kind of goat-related species.
Caribou up there too?
They have a subspecies
Perry?
of Peary caribou, yeah, but they've kind of blanked out with climate change. There was a survey 20 years ago. There was a couple thousand, and they did a survey maybe 3 years ago, and they saw like a dozen. So yeah, there's a real life change that's happening there that I've seen. I've only been going there for 10 years, but yeah, that's a huge concern up there. These are some of the foxes that would wake me up when I'd be sleeping. They've never seen humans before. They're curious and come by, chew on their tent guidelines. And there was this one morning when I was up there in the tent alone and woken up by the fox kits and saw the wolves around the landscape down below a few miles, and I wandered out on foot to go try to spend some time with them, and got there, and they were starting to do this thing where it's like a pack rally where they're all waking up from being sleepy wolves for 10, 12 hours, and they want to get up and do something. And so they get to come together, they howl together, they rub against each other, they have this whole interaction. And then there can be this stalling out of the next move where some of them feel like if the oldest wolves aren't ready to go hunting yet, then there'll be this, sometimes it can last for like an hour where the younger ones will want to go, the teenagers are ready to go, but the older ones aren't yet. It can be this kind of slow progression. And I had this understanding they were going to start moving to the west, and they were going to move eventually towards this muskox herd that was in the distance that I had seen from my camp up on the hill. And I wanted to get there before then. So I started moving. I started kind of jogging a little bit. I had a backpack on, and I had a couple cameras. Got maybe a mile ahead of them. I looked behind, and the wolves were coming. This was a pack of 14 adults, and there were 5 pups. Left a few of the adults behind with the pups. So it's this group of maybe 10 wolves, and they're coming towards this muskox herd. And I get across this creek, and I look over, and this wolf is one that I've known for years. I call him Gray Mane because he had kind of a more grayer color in his coat. And I realized that we're running next to each other. We're running side by side towards what is food for both of us. And it was this remembering for me, it was just a brief moment of remembering that older relationship, this time when humans likely have done that many times over the last tens of thousands of years with wolves. We evolved to hunt the same things. Eventually we brought them into our homes. And these wild places are an opportunity for us to remember some of those parts of ourselves. It's an opportunity for me to remember this idea of what domestication and relationship between different species could look like and feel like. And it's something that I think is one of the important things about these wildlands is it allows for some of these remembrances for us, for humans, and these relationships that we can have, not just with wolves, but with other animals as well.
Running here 15 more minutes.
Perfect. This is part of that remembering. I grew up vegetarian, but in the last few years have started to learn the relationship to food in a different way and hunting. And this is an elk from just a few months ago that I took with a bow and arrow. And I don't have a religious background. I don't come from like a spiritual specific family or undertaking, but realizing this is something that is natural for humans to recreate ritual and ceremony. There's a Robin Wall Kimmerer quote around ceremony is how we remember to remember. And it's a very human thing that we can all rekindle within ourselves, this relationship to the natural world, relationship to food. Every time I eat this animal, I brought some home to share with my family. It is a type of ceremony way of offering this animal. This is available to all of us, this idea of rekindling that relationship. I am going to end with a short poem. This is a poem by Wendell Berry. It's called A Vision. If we will have the wisdom to survive, to stand like slow-growing trees on a ruined place, renewing, enriching it, if we will make our seasons welcome here, asking not too much of earth or heaven, then a long time after we are dead, the lives of our lives prepare for will live there, their houses strongly placed upon the valley sides, fields and gardens rich in the windows. The river will run clear as we will never know it, and over it, bird song like a canopy. On the levels of the hills will be green meadows, stock bells and noon shade. On the steeps where greed and ignorance cut down the old forest, an old forest will stand. Its rich leaf fall drifting on its roots. The veins of forgotten springs will have opened. Families will be singing in the fields. In their voices, they will hear a music risen out of the ground. They will take nothing from the ground, they will not return, whatever the grief at parting. Memory native to this land will spread over it like a grove, and memory will grow into legend, legend into song, song into sacrament. The abundance of this place, the songs of its people and its birds, will be health and wisdom and indwelling light. This is no paradisal dream. Its hardship is its possibility. Thank you.
Thank you. John Davis.
That was beautiful. Beautiful. Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. I want to thank Terry and John East for organizing this. I also want to thank my Adirondack Council colleagues, Rocky Aguirre, Executive Director, Jackie Bowen, Conservation Director, Jenny Sherline, Development Director. Not many New York bosses, but that staff person ventured to Boston Red Sox territory. So really grateful to go into Toronto Blue Jays territory. So honored to be working with my Adirondack Council friends and Jon Leibowitz, Northeast Village Trust others. I'm going to just give a quick overview of what rewilding the Northeast might look like, and John will follow up with some more details and particulars of the vision. But I should say I'm Jon Leibowitz, Adirondack Council, and I'm lucky enough to live in Adirondack Park, where arguably rewilding was born. Adirondack Park, as most of you know, has a century-plus long history of wildlands protection, almost miraculous today. It would be very hard to accomplish what our forebears in Adirondack Park did a century ago. And I think the Adirondack Park can be seen as an anchor for the rewilding of the much larger region. And I contend that actually rewilding has begun in the northeastern United States and to a lesser degree in southeastern Canada, but that we have a long way to go yet. In Adirondack Park, we have protected a forever wild state, nearly 3 million acres. And I challenge you New Englanders to match our ratio. We're way ahead of you so far, so we have a lot of work to do. I will talk a little bit about the rewilding successes already gained. We've restored quite a few species who were absent, who had been extirpated in the past. And I'm forgetting how you advance these. Technical support, please. Okay, thank you. So the term rewilding was coined by my friend and mentor, the late wilderness champion Dave Foreman, about 3 decades ago. And if you want to read one book summarizing what rewilding would mean in North America, I recommend his book, Rewilding North America. This very simple coarse scale map comes from that book. Dave Foreman suggested that rewilding North America can best proceed along the lines of the continental mountain ranges and the boreal forest. That is, we should think about rewilding in all regions and at all scales, but feasibly in the near term where we might hope to achieve significant gains is in the Appalachians and Adirondacks, the Rocky Mountains, the Pacific Crest and Coast, and the boreal forest. Some of us have since argued that we should pay equal attention to the Great Plains and the Gulf Coast and add continental wildways through the Great Plains and the Gulf Coast as proposals. Dave Foreman was actually working on that for a sequel to Rewilding North America, but unfortunately he died before he could finish it. But what Dave Foreman meant by rewilding was large-scale wilderness recovery, including protecting and restoring the full range of wildlife species, including the top carnivores. Ronan just spoke beautifully about wolves. Wolves are a keystone species. They're a top carnivore. They're a measure of how well we are protecting our landscapes. And as most of you know, we've lost our top carnivores from the northeastern United States. And one of the ultimate goals of rewilding in this region is to see wolves and pumas and other missing species, but particularly those two, return. Whoops. As I say, we've enjoyed a number of rewilding successes already. It's often forgotten, but actually probably 10 or more species that are now thriving in our region were virtually extirpated a century ago. Beavers are among them because of trapping and habitat destruction. They were almost gone a century ago. Now they're thriving. They're a keystone species. They enhance natural habitats. They create habitats that benefit a wide range of native species. We can count beaver recovery as a rewilding success and build on that. Years ago, Wildlands Network sent me off on a long trek to explore the wilder parts of the eastern United States and help create a vision for rewilding in the East. This map resulted from those explorations and from a lot of GIS work and map research involving groups like the Nature Conservancy, Staying Connected, and other groups. This is just a very coarse scale vision showing what would be priorities for protection in the eastern United States. The chief scientist who did the map, Ron Sutherland, started the research without any preconceived notion about what percentage of the East should be protected. Interestingly, this map shows in proposed wild cores and wildlife corridors roughly half of the eastern United States, which corresponds nicely to the half-Earth vision articulated by Reed Noss, E.O. Wilson, and others. And an increasingly accepted goal for conservation is that if we want to stem the extinction crisis, we do need to, in various ways, including through conservation easements on private lands, voluntary agreements with landowners, economic incentives for good land stewardship, and public ownership and wilderness protection, we need to protect about half of our lands and waters to stem the extinction crisis. For our region, sorry, this is fuzzy, but for our region, this is a slightly more detailed look at what a viable habitat reserve network might mean. I want to emphasize these big green blobs, they still have private land, they still have roads, they still have towns. They are simply showing ecological and conservation priorities. Adirondack Park obviously is not all one big wild place. It's a complex of multiple wild units and towns and roads. But the hope is that in these proposed wildlife cores and corridors, landowners would be given strong incentives for good stewardship, and farmers and others would strive to do their practices in wildlife-friendly ways. Fisher, another rewilding success story, thriving in our region. And if any of you get bothered by porcupines eating your sheds or outhouses, you should celebrate the return of fishers. They're the most effective predators of porcupines out there. If we eventually see pumas return, they also will eat porcupines. One of the issues that Adirondack Council works on a lot is promoting a connection, a habitat corridor, a wildway through Adirondack Park, across the St. Lawrence Valley into southern Ontario's Algonquin Park. We call it A to A, the Adirondack to Algonquin axis. This is a regionally and continentally critical wildway or wildlife corridor. It's getting more and more attention, but the development threats, particularly in the St. Lawrence Valley, are growing. The parks are relatively well protected. A whole lot of dark green in Adirondack Park, a whole lot in Algonquin Park. But between the two great parks, development rates are fairly high and habitat fragmentation is a real issue. So one of the things we're doing is working with land trusts like the Northeast Wilderness Trust, which owns several key parcels in this area, helping land trusts identify places to protect and working with state agencies to find means of offering greater habitat protection in this area, and also making safe wildlife crossings a priority for this area. Rewilding, among the many tools of rewilding, is putting in safe overpasses and underpasses for safe wildlife crossings. These are especially important in the St. Lawrence Valley so that animals can successfully move between the two great parks. This is just a typical scene from A to A, from the This is northwestern Adirondack Park. This is also part of the Adirondack Council's proposed Bob Marshall or Oswegatchie Great Wildlands Complex. Wonderful canoe camping country. This curious stream is called the Gulf Stream. So we have our own Gulf Stream in the Northeast United States, much smaller than the better known one. As I mentioned, rewilding needs to happen at all scales. Another project with which Adirondack Council and partners, Northeast Wilderness Trust, again, key partner, is Split Rock Wildway, Wildlife Corridor linking Lake Champlain with the Adirondack High Peaks to the west. The point to make from this photo is you see a lot of rectangles and odd shapes, a lot of boundaries, a lot of edges. One of the challenges of protecting and restoring habitat connections really anywhere in the United States, but especially in the eastern United States, is many ownerships. In the east, we almost always, except perhaps in northern Maine, where the ownerships tend to be large and in the hands of logging companies, in most of the eastern United States, in order to protect the key wildways between the cores, we will have to work with many landowners. These are typically small and medium-sized parcels. It takes almost as work, John could say from extensive experience, it takes almost as much work to save 50 acres as it takes to save 500. I think it's fair to say sometimes. And so that's one of the challenges in protecting wildways is we will need to work with hundreds of different landowners, and it's very time consuming. You almost need to have devoted staff who are going around and talking to landowners. It's not always about land acquisition, not even always about conservation easement. Sometimes it's about voluntary agreements. Sometimes it's about teaching landowners wildlife-friendly practices. Not quite so magnificent, perhaps, as the wolves of Ellesmere Island, but this is an eastern coyote, and there are questions circulating through our region about whether we may have wolves coming back or whether our coyotes have interbred with wolves. Actually, that's pretty well documented. The eastern coyotes of the northeastern United States have interbred with wolves somewhat. And so while some of us feel that in order to regain pumas eventually, active reintroduction would need to be considered, we can reasonably hope that perhaps wolves will come back on their own if we protect enough habitat. And in any case, some of their genes are already here. This, I would guess, this eastern coyote might be nearly a third wolf. This is a hefty animal photographed from one of our cameras in Split Rock Wildway. And they are to some degree, these large eastern coyotes to some degree are starting to play some of the role of wolves, but they're still not taking many live adult deer, and they very rarely, if ever, take moose. And of course, you need predators to take the native herbivores. Another key wildway, another part of knitting back together the northeastern United States is the southern Lake Champlain Valley, the connection between Adirondack Park and Vermont's Green Mountains. By the way, the botanist here on the left with the hat, that's Jerry Jenkins. If you don't know Jerry's work, I highly recommend it. He puts out outstanding publications about plant communities, and of course, rewilding is about plants too. Look up Northern Forest Atlas Project.org and you'll see some of his work. But this is a key wildlife habitat connection between the Adirondacks and Greens. This is a view from Belvedere Mountain, northern Greens of Vermont. This is part of the Cold Hollow to Canada, or Northern Greens to Sutton's connection, another key wildway, part of a larger vision for rewilding the northeastern United States and southeastern Canada. This is one of the areas where wildlife crossings are most needed. This is the Israel River just north of the Presidential Range between the towns of Randolph and Jefferson. Here, a place called Bowman Divide, which John and I recently visited with our friend Brad Micklejohn of the Conservation Fund. There's an urgent need for a safe wildlife crossing there. There's a big problem. Route 2 passes right between the Presidentials and the Kilkennys. Many of you know that area. Very heavy traffic, a lot of big truck traffic. Roadkills are terrible problems. People drive fast, people drive all night. Brad and his parents have been working for decades to get a safe wildlife crossing installed at Bowman Divide. I've been talking with Terry about that, hoping that Terry can pull some political levers to help make that happen. All we need is $5 million. We can get a safe wildlife. That's just a start. That would just be an underpass. We need overpasses and multiple underpasses ultimately, but a very good start could be made with $5 million. And it could be a very educational effort too. This is a really popular area for hiking in the White Mountains. And there could be signs educating people on why there's a temporary slowing of the traffic and why ultimately this road will be much safer for moose and lynx and bears and others who are presently at risk when they try to cross. one of the grander proposals pertaining to a viable habitat reserve system for the northeastern United States for rewilding the Northeast is restore the North Woods proposal for a Maine Woods National Park. Their proposal is for about a 3.2 million acre park, not counting Baxter State Park, which would be enveloped by it. So really a 3.5 million acre park. Jamie Sion of the Northern Forest Forum years ago proposed an even more visionary plan, which would protect about 8 million acres of northern Maine and northern New Hampshire. And Jamie pointed out you could protect those 6 million acres for about the price, I think he said, of 3 B-2 bombers. The land back then was very cheap, still pretty cheap. It's mostly owned by absentee corporations, timber companies who are not making much profit anyway. For a very small amount of money, a very large area in northern Maine, northern New Hampshire could be protected. Roxanne Quimby of Burt's Bees took some good steps that direction years ago when she pieced together about 50,000 acres, gave it to the federal government under the Obama administration to create Katahdin Woods and Waters National Monument, which is in that area. And that there are great opportunities to build on Roxanne's great wildlands philanthropy success to grow a Maine Woods National Park. Another area where there's great conservation and restoration and rewilding potential is in the Three Borders area where Maine, Quebec, and New Brunswick come together. This is the St. Francis River, which is almost like a mirror image of the Allagash River in its flow pattern and its scenery. And it's a really sparsely settled area with great rewilding potential. Could be a colleague I met in that area years ago was proposing a Three Borders International Peace Park, a vision well worth pursuing. Of course, rewilding is about waters as much as it is about lands. And in fact, much of the really good work we can do in the near term in our region, I believe, is dam removal and culvert placement. Culverts may seem a rather boring topic, but they are actually an urgent concern for wildlife. Poorly placed or undersized or perched culverts can block movement of amphibians and fish. And one of the important tasks for conservationists and engineers is to replace undersized and perched culverts with ones that are suitable for wildlife movement, that are at grade, allow fish and amphibians to pass, and that are also more durable for the worsening storms that we will inevitably see. And of course, there's many opportunities. We're seeing roads and bridges and culverts wash out almost every summer now in our region. When they wash out, we should replace them with wildlife-friendly, climate-durable versions. And we have across our region hundreds of deadbeat dams, or derelict dams might be the more polite way to say it. And those should be dismantled. And I'm not talking about dismantling functioning hydropower dams, but the dams that are needlessly blocking water flow, those should be removed. It's very important for Atlantic salmon, American eel, and other diatomeous fish to remove these derelict dams.
15 minutes.
Thanks. Okay, this is the Restigouche River, which I show because this is one of the few places left in our area where Atlantic salmon are still thriving. This is New Brunswick. Chick-Chock Mountains, Gaspésie National Park in Quebec, near the end of the Appalachian Mountains. It's the last place south of the St. Lawrence River where caribou still survive, though they are in trouble because of climate chaos. There are also lynx here. And this is the end of the Appalachians Forillon National Park, where the mountains dive into the ocean, apparently to reemerge in Scotland. I'm not sure if that's really true. I have to ask a geologist. But this is a wonderful park that takes in lands and waters where you can see whales and dolphins and bears and lynx. Great small-scale protection story. And I finish with a painting by my friend Ronan Donovan, Puma, Almost Home. If we are successful in our rewilding efforts, maybe within your children's lifetimes, it will be possible to see this magnificent animal back on the ground. Thank you all.
Last speaker, Jon Leibowitz. Thank you, John Davis. That was excellent.
All right, just give me 1 second to get settled here. Well, thank you, Paul and Ronan, John. That was amazing. Thank you very much. I am going to be talking about hope is wild and rewilding the Northeast USA. And again, my name is Jon Leibowitz. I'm the CEO of Northeast Wilderness Trust. So I want to start by talking about a common characteristic that is amongst all the world's most biodiverse places. And this characteristic has the power to restore degraded ecosystems, and its presence or its lack thereof defines the health of every place on the planet. And it's created the very conditions that gave rise to our civilization and our society. And it's also the wellspring of life. And yet we don't typically talk about this characteristic when we talk about land conservation. It here in New England can also turn young forests today into old growth forests of tomorrow. So what is this characteristic? It is freedom. And tonight I'm going to discuss why freedom is the fundamental characteristic to a hopeful future. But to set the stage, I want to start with a story from a few thousand miles away, where I grew up in South Florida. And 40 years ago, where I grew up in Miami, it was still a kind of wildish place. And that's me with my dad. And our home was surrounded by this remnant pocket of saw palmetto pines. And when I got a little bit older, I used to spend a lot of my time walking around this path in our backyard with my dog, Snuggles. And that is me and Snuggles walking around. And I remember that this path went on for miles, and there were raccoons and foxes and spiders and butterflies. And I later learned that this path that was so important to me was only about 100 feet long. but back then, it was more than long enough to imprint a relationship with nature and with the local critters who I shared that backyard with. And that place that you can see in that image in many ways no longer exists. Today, what is called a pine rockland natural community, which used to occupy up to 200,000 acres in Miami-Dade County, functionally has disappeared from that area and only exists today in Everglades National Park. Now, this is a story that is common to our culture around the world of less. That means less biodiversity, less natural beauty, and less abundance. And this happens to be my story. I imagine many people here have similar stories from your childhood. And if you don't, I suspect that many of you still know about ecological loss and the common story that we all share. So I want to bring this now back to New England. And this, if I can make it work, is a map. Sorry, it's a little small. That shows all the old growth forests in the United States before Europeans arrived. And I want to just be super clear, this is an imperfect map, but it serves a role in illustrating a point. And so I want to ask a question for the room, and please just yell it out. What percent of New England today do you think is old growth forest or primary forest that's never been cut?
0.001.
0.001. Any other guesses?
1%.
1%. All right. Well, you guys were both very accurate. And so the answer, and here's an illustration, the same map, a mere fraction of 1%, barely noticeable. Each of these dots, which is very hard to see, represents 25,000 acres. You can see there's a little bit in the Adirondacks, a little in northern Maine. And with those disappearing forests, also, as John talked about, cougars and wolves and many other species disappeared, and rivers became dammed, and once plentiful salmon runs disappeared as well. And so this is a story that we all know, and it's a story of less. But it doesn't have to be that way. And this is not about doom and gloom. I don't think that despair solves problems, but hope, on the other hand, has a solid track record. And there is a proven and hopeful path to bring back abundance and bring back natural diversity. And that's what Jon talked about, and it's rewilding. And there's a lot of ways to describe rewilding, but I will repeat what Jon mentioned, which is it could be distilled down to two simple words, as Dave Foreman said, and that is wilderness recovery. So if rewilding is about the recovery of wilderness, we need to understand what that word means. And I'm going to begin to answer that through another example. And I want to go together to a special place in Maine. This is called Howland Research Forest, and it is a remnant tract of old growth forest. It's near Bangor, and in 2007, this place was at risk of being logged. And with a group of supporters, Northeast Wilderness Trust stepped in and purchased it, and we protected it as forever wild. Now, there is nothing whatsoever ecologically exceptional about Howland Research Forest. It's what some would call a typical northern evergreen forest. It's dominated by common species. There's no rich soils. It's as flat as can be. The exceptional thing about Howland Research Forest is its freedom. This forest, is another photo of it, has been given the freedom to grow old and beautiful and complex. And for the past 20 years, it's been legally protected as wilderness, which I will get into explaining what that means. And there's a path on this property, and as you walk along the path that connects these carbon towers, and there's a lot of research that goes on here, you can feel below your feet exceptionally spongy floor, which is also full of pits and mounds that you can see here, which is decades and hundreds of years of accumulated old trees. And you can feel the air that's dense beneath this old canopy. And you start to notice things about the forest. And you'll notice, and I'm going to start from the bottom left, there's multiple layers of fallen trees, and there's a mixed canopy and understory, and there's mature trees and young trees, and there's snags, and there's tip-ups, which are fallen over trees, and there's all these little hidey holes with seed banks and moist areas in the forest floor. And so this is a good example of what a forest, at least in this part of Maine, wants to be. It wants to be a little messy. And as Henry David Thoreau wrote about Maine's North Woods, it wants to be a little mossy and moosey as well. And I mentioned that because when Henry David Thoreau wrote those words about Maine's North Woods, there were trees on Howland that were just approaching their teenage years in 1864. Howland Research Forest is the way it is today because it's been granted freedom. And that is precisely what wilderness is. So I'd ask you to consider what you think the word wilderness means, what that means to you. And there are certainly a lot of meanings, and it is often a very misunderstood word as well. And so one way to understand wilderness is that it is land that is left to its own will. And the etymological roots of the word, as described in this paper by Jay Vest, who's a member of the Monacan Nation, and a researcher and a professor, it means will of the land. So wilderness is self-willed land or free land. And just northeast of here, where we are, let's see if I can, in the White Mountain National Forest, are large federally protected wilderness areas like the Sandwich Range Wilderness, ushered in by the landmark 1964 Wilderness Act. And the authors of the Wilderness Act also centered their definition on this very idea of freedom. And they used the word untrammeled to describe wilderness. And things that are untrammeled are free, and things that are trammeled are impeded. And really central to this idea is that not a single time in the Wilderness Act is the word pristine used. And that word is often wrongly associated with wilderness, but wilderness has nothing to do with a place being pristine, but it has to do with it being free. And so at Northeast Wilderness Trust, we've taken both of these definitions both the Wilderness Act's definition using untrammeled and Jay Vest's definition. And we say that wilderness is not simply a special kind of place, but rather a special commitment that one makes to a place. And that commitment is to freedom, to animals, and to natural processes that produce integrity, beauty, and diversity of the land community. So again, wilderness is not being about pristine or being about unlogged or even about being unpeopled, as Ronan was talking about. It is about freedom for the land. And that is precisely the work of Northeast Wilderness Trust, where I have the pleasure of working, protecting places like Howland Research Forest and Birch Stream Wilderness Preserve in Maine, as you can see here. Dozens and dozens of wilderness preserves that we've protected across the Northeast, where we now actively conserve and safeguard 103,000 acres of wilderness and counting. And we use the tried and true legal tools of land trusts to acquire land and permanently protect it as forever wild. We prohibit logging and we employ passive rewilding on our lands. And Northeast Wilderness Trust is the only land trust in the Northeast that's focused exclusively on this work of forever wild conservation. And because of that, we also stand alone in being able to say that every piece of land that we protect is a future old growth forest because we prohibit logging and we employ passive management. So one example of that, as Terry mentioned, is just north of here in the Upper Valley in Orford. And we just purchased these beautiful, stunningly beautiful 2,000 acres, which we now call the Spruce Ridge Wilderness Preserve. And it's adjacent to the Appalachian Trail. It's in Orford and in Lyme. Unlike Howland, this piece of land is not old growth. It's been managed for decades, but now it has been legally protected as forever wild and has thus been offered that freedom to evolve and to grow and to heal. And what that means, in other words, is that we've laid down the roots for this forest to become an old growth forest of the future. And so while old growth today only makes up a fraction of New England, every single time a place is protected as forever wild, whether it's on private land or as wilderness on public land, it's an old growth forest of the future. And that's a wildly hopeful vision. So what are some of the values that come back to a landscape when you protect places like Spruce Ridge? So I'll run through these. The first is biodiversity. The species of New England co-evolved with old and wild forests for millennia. And when you bring back old and wild forests, species thrive within them. We also know that old forests or wild forests become old forests, and old forests store abundant amounts of carbon. And from research at Howland, we know that that accumulation and sequestration continues as they get older. Wilderness areas also serve as incredibly important baselines and reference points for foresters and for managers of other surrounding forests. You can look at a wilderness area to see what the natural community is doing, responding to climate change, whatever it may be. Solace, reflection, and recreation have always been very important parts of protecting wilderness and the why. And then, of course, resiliency. As a forest becomes older and more complex, it naturally becomes more resilient as well. So those are some of the examples. And now I want to get into kind of the practical and what Northeast Wilderness Trust does, what it means to actually protect these places. So we've established that wilderness equals freedom, but how do you actually make it that in the real world? And so land trusts are very well suited to do this. And I'll explain why. So a couple years ago, Northeast Wilderness Trust had the pleasure of co-publishing a report called Wildlands in New England. And within that report, we came up with 3 criteria that really define what makes a wild land. And the 3 are intent, management, and permanence. So is there intent for this place to be wild? Is it actually being managed as wild? And very important, is there a legal protection so it remains wilderness forever? And why that durability is so important is when you're trying to rewild a landscape, for a piece of land to become old and wild and become an old growth forest of tomorrow, you have to have time. It takes decades or even centuries to bring those characteristics back to a landscape, and it could take mere days to erase that progress. So permanence is really important. So what does this actually look like in New England? This is a map, and I include New York as well, because as John mentioned, Northeast Wilderness Trust works there too, but I will focus on New England. This is a map that shows all protected land in New England, and very impressively, 25% or thereabouts of New England is protected. That includes all kinds of land, from farmland to land that's managed for timber, to wildlands, and to national forests, which have logging and wilderness areas on them. So I'd like to, again, ask for some participation. When you look at this map, if 25% is all protected land, what percentage of New England do you think is forever wild or equivalent or wilderness?
2.
2? Pretty close. Any other guesses? All right, we're going to stick with 2. So the answer is 3.3%. So look at this map, burn that into your mind's eye, and we're going to pull back a layer.
Whoops.
That is all the land that's conserved as wilderness. And as John mentioned, the Adirondacks are way ahead of where New England is, where nearly 3 million acres have been protected as wilderness, and only about 1.3 million acres in the rest of New England. So I would argue we can and we must do a lot better than that.
15 minutes.
Okay, so I'm going to shift gears to kind of finish my talk here. You've now heard about why wilderness is essential, yet underrepresented. You've also learned how it's practically applied and what defines it. So I want to close by looking towards the future and recognizing what is possible if we protect more wilderness today. But what exactly would that future look like in New England? And to help with that, I want to tell you about a wild place that I visited further afield a couple of years ago that inspires in me the possibility of what is possible and hope. And that's me on the left, and this was a trip that we went on in Alaska. And we on this trip, saw caribou and Arctic fox, more than 100 coastal brown bears. And I can say that with assurance because somebody in our party sitting right there counted every single one of them on our trip. And this is one of those bears that we saw from a bluff that we were camping on. And in between hiking, we also paddled rivers that were full of salmon, many of them being enjoyed by bear along the way. So Alaska is a land of abundance. And I went there very intentionally to remind myself what abundance looks and feels like, and what could be, again, here in New England. So New England at one point was more biodiverse and abundant than Alaska is today. And I want you to think about that right here in New England, there were once runs of salmon and shad and sturgeon and eels by the millions. There were caribou in northern New England. There were elk in southern New England. And all across this region, there were vast ancient forests that dominated and made up the very character of this place, and not the remnant pockets that we see today. Yet ecologically speaking, while that seems like a distant past, it actually was not long ago at all. And if we shift our perspective from our human timescales that we think in into tree time or ecological time, it was actually very, very recently. And I want to briefly revisit Howe and Research Forest to talk about that idea. This tree, which is not very attractive, and it's not, not much to look at, but this yellow birch growing quietly at Howland Research Forest is 400 years old. And it has witnessed every single change that New England has experienced in its single lifetime. And so I wanted you to really think about that this single birch predates every single conservation organization that exists today. It predates our notions of forestry and best management practices. It predates the Wilderness Act that I've talked about and the U.S. Forest Service and the very founding of our nation. And through it all, it's simply done what trees do, which is release oxygen, provide habitat, and hold its place in this forest. And to me, that birch is a living reminder of that promise of wilderness and what's possible right here in New England. So I want to close by inviting you to imagine with me what this wild and hopeful New England, maybe a century from now, could look like. That we have the opportunity today to leave to our children, like my adorable son in that photo, and maybe your children and grandchildren. And so first, I want you to imagine an overwhelming majority of forests in this future state have been conserved, and amongst those millions of acres of wilderness. And across those conserved forests, there's towering pines that stretch 125 feet into the sky, and century-old maples, and oaks and hemlocks and beech are common sight and not the exceptions to the norm that they are today. And each spring, that canopy is full of waves of warblers singing their beautiful songs that have all found their niche in this forest. And martin and fisher, as Jon talked about, they're finding ample habitat in those complex forests and now define the region. And dams have come down, not everyone, but many of them, and schools of salmon and shad and sturgeon are repopulating rivers and feeding the land and feeding people and feeding wildlife. Cougars and wolves in our region's missing carnivores have been welcomed home, keeping prey in check, but also teaching us the important lessons of coexistence, as Ronan was talking about. And across this landscape, farmlands and timberlands and expansive wilderness areas are all knitted together. And in this imagined future, those wilderness areas that are being protected today are all becoming older and wilder and more complex and accessible to people. And they are regaining their footing in New England and returning to the way that this region used to be and can be again. So I just want to conclude by saying that we can begin, each and every one of us, in our own way to help make this future real for our children and grandchildren and future generations of wildlife as well. And the next century of New England's wild story can begin right now if we choose to make the decisions and create wilderness today. Thank you so much.
I thought that are three excellent presentations. If you three would come on up here, we've got about 20 minutes or so. John, is that fair or whatever as far as Q&A?
We got till 7:30.
Okay, so we won't keep you here that long, but come on up here. And I would like to open it up to questions. Does anybody have any questions? I certainly had one. Were you ever afraid of being eaten by a wolf?
Yes, that question is. No, I never was. Those wolves, wolves in Montana, but in the Arctic, they're not shy. Never been snapped at, or bitten, or growled at. I've had more run-ins with dogs
And humans.
definitely humans. Yeah, horses, cows. But yeah, wolves. They follow directions. I mean, anyone who knows dogs, like some dogs understand boundaries really well. And the same thing.
Yes.
I have a question, is also a comment, and I don't want to take more time than I should. Do any of you have any experience working with the EU on their conservation efforts? I just think about that just for a second, because I do, and I've lived in the Adirondacks, and I think the Adirondacks are a spectacular, under-publicized example of coexistence with wilderness. I was working in Vienna, taking my students on a river trip once with a guide in a park nearby in canoes. We had licenses to do it. We were planned it for quite a while. We got partway down the river, and the guide I was with said, "You cannot go any farther." And I said, "What are you talking about? We're being careful. We're being responsible. We have a permit to work here today." She said, "You don't understand. In the EU, there are 9 different categories of land management, and there are even multiple categories of wilderness, and each of them have different characteristics. You've come up against a border where humans are not allowed to enter under any circumstance. And I was just like going, I've never even heard of that kind of wilderness. Anyway, I just want to plant it out there that Europe is way ahead of us on most of these issues. Now, they have a lot of catching up to do because they have a higher population density. But I think we could really learn a lot from people who are working harder and longer and more coordinated than our fragment way of the United States. Anyway, just wanted to mention that.
Any comment on that or?
Yeah, just recommend for people interested in knowing about efforts in Europe. There's a very strong rewilding Europe movement.
Yeah.
Just Google rewilding Europe and you'll find scores of great examples of land protection and wildlife restoration underway. And the Rewilding Institute, rewilding.org, just has done a 3-part series on lynx, bear, and wolf recovery in Europe, and I recommend those as well.
Yes.
So, when you talked about land preservation, you talked about the possibility of volunteer agreements. So I'm thinking about people that have smaller parcels of land, like under 100 acres, that may want to preserve those, but a land trust may not be interested in pursuing that because of the size or the location. How, is there any possibility for opportunities for people that have land in current use to put that in a permanent agreement to not to be developed without deeding it?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one of the most challenging aspects of land trust work is it's very expensive and resources are limited. And as a result, to the point that you just made, many land trusts struggle working on smaller parcels, whether it's 50 acres or 100 acres, or in some cases even bigger. First off, I would just say for Northeast Wilderness Trust, I can just speak to my personal experience. There's no minimum size. We have a conservation easement on a 15-acre property, and we have a conservation easement on a 10,000-acre property. So it really depends on the context and what your property or what properties you're talking about are near. If they're near other conserved lands, if they're isolated in the middle of a subdivision, that's one thing. If it's near an area that makes it helpful from a resource perspective in a land trust to pursue. So to answer your question more directly, there are, I think there are some legal mechanisms that a private individual can take without a land trust. There's things called like declarations of trust, which is a type of deed restriction that perhaps you could look into. There's also just more generic deed restrictions, which I think that's not what you wanted. Yeah, it's a tough question. I think the reality is that with limited resources, land trusts tend to focus on larger projects. I'll just add one other thing. There's often a difference, at least with Northeast Wilderness Trust, between doing a conservation easement and buying land outright. And we often will be more willing and able to buy land and turn it into a wilderness preserve, especially if it has good context, then we are able to work on a conservation easement. So that's just another idea to think about.
Thanks.
Yes.
I have another question for you. Like, how do you think about your forest? Do you only purchase land or go into conservation easements on forests that are like good forests, or do you work on forests that have existing problems like hard cuts, beach infestations, like 30 acres of barberry? Are you doing any management on those lands or nothing at all?
Yeah. So I often look towards the Adirondacks as the inspiration. So Northeast Wilderness Trust truly believes in the idea of rewilding and the power and resilience of nature when it's given time and space and freedom to respond to all those variables that you just talked about. In the Adirondack Park, in many cases, those lands became forest preserve when they were in very poor shape, as you just mentioned. And over the course of the last century, they've become healthier and more biodiverse and store more carbon. And that's all been done primarily through passive management, at least on the public lands that are forever wild. And so Northeast Wilderness Trust's founding was actually completely inspired by what happened in the Adirondacks and bringing that idea to New England. And so we do buy land quite often that is been clear cut or that's in very bad shape, if you want to characterize it that way. And we generally employ complete passive management. And that's not to say that we're not observing and paying attention and documenting where there might be invasives or where there might be one issue or another. But we have found in our limited history so far, but using examples like the Adirondacks, that again, if you protect the place and we say, you step up to protect it and then you step back by allowing nature to heal through rewilding, that it often can take care of itself and respond in a way to the world that's changing around it. It's the forests of tomorrow, whether you manage them or not, are not going to look like the forests of today or the forests of yesterday. There's too much changing with climate and other variables. So we have only one perspective, and that's not to say that managing for invasives is bad or the wrong tactic, but we really believe that there ought to be these controls or these baselines on the landscape. And we really want to know what happens if you buy a piece of land that has barberry all over it. And if you don't manage it for 100 years, we don't know the answer. And nobody actually knows the answer. Even the best experts in this area, nobody has been alive long enough to know what will happen to a forest in today's world if you just let things evolve. And that's the experiment that Northeast Wilderness Trust at least is engaged in. Yes.
Is there any kind of a public resource for maybe rating land? If we're going to conserve half of what's out there, some is going to be more important than others, and some land is going to have to be left for shopping malls and cities and that kind of thing. So maybe some kind of an online tool for understanding how important land is in a certain area or at what level of conservation.
I can start. So in Adirondack Park, the Adirondack Council decades ago put out a 2020 vision series, which set priorities for land conservation. It's actually one of the most effective conservation visions ever put out. It has guided state land acquisition for decades now, and much of what we proposed decades ago in 2020 vision has been protected. At a much larger scale, Wildlands Network has done that, has done those maps I showed, has done that for the east and then in more detail for the northeast. They don't really use a rating criteria so much as they look at the importance of big wild cores connected by wildlife corridors. So that's one way of looking at priorities. It's not the only way. Reed Noss and Michael Sule, in an article in Wild Earth decades ago, argued that we should do that large scale, that coarse scale conservation planning and designing and envisioning, and also look in detail at sites with rare and endangered species. So they said rewilding is a complement to biodiversity conservation of the form that Nature Conservancy has practiced so expertly for a long time. So you save the big wild connected places, but you also find the rare examples with endemic species. There actually is quite a bit of mapping along those lines these days. And Nature Conservancy, Wildlands Network are among the places to look. And then in Adirondack Park, Adirondack Council.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I was just gonna point out the Nature Conservancy has maps, like GIS maps that you can use for that point out state by state the most critical habitat, and then region by region. Each state is also working on state wildlife action plans. New Hampshire should be, I think, delivered this week, we were told. So each
That's
town
online.
has these maps kind of overlaid on them. And the point of the wildlife action plan is planting wildlife and shows kind of those habitat maps as well as the most critical in a given area. So like if you're on your conservation commission, it's a really, really good resource.
Great.
Just had a question with related to some of the benchmarks and with your messaging as an organization. Do you find that you have to sort of combine your messaging of what your benchmarks are with sort of the benchmarks of the working forest to have a more effective communication or messaging strategy? And I'm thinking of like the work for the Harvard Forest and David Foster and those folks to say we can both provide our fair share of wood products and get to wild wilderness areas. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. So a couple comments there. On most of our on many of our projects, we are combining wildlands and woodlands as a goal, and I'll share one example right now. In Maine, Northeast Wilderness Trust is partnering with 3 other organizations on a big project called the McGalloway Collaborative. It's a 78,000 acre conservation deal, and Northeast Wilderness Trust is buying just about 11,500 acres, which will be a forever wild preserve. But then we're also working with the Forest Society of Maine, who's putting a conservation easement on about 55 or 60,000 acres, which will continue to be privately owned and managed for timber. And so that's an example on the ground of conservation by design, where Northeast Wilderness Trust partners with other organizations that are doing 2 sides of the exact same coin. And we're always very careful to point out, and I always can do a better job during doing presentations, that it's not an either or between wildlands or woodlands. It's wildlands and woodlands. We all, of course, need wood products, and the managed forest is a crucial element of the Northeast. Specific to your question, so Harvard Forest has the Wildlands, Woodlands, Farmlands, and Communities Initiative. So I sit on the steering committee of that group. And the goal of WWF&C is that 80% of New England is permanently conserved. And a vast majority of that is as managed forest and farmland. But also of that 80%, 10 to 20% ought to be wildlands. And they just put out an incredible report called Beyond the Illusion of Preservation that actually looks into the fundamentals of the economics and demonstrates that even if we were to conserve 20% of New England as permanently protected wilderness, which is millions of more acres than exist today, that New England can still supply the needed timber for our economy here. And they did the economic breakdown and show that going from 3.3% today to even 20%, which again is millions of acres, is possible while still supporting the forest products industry. And it's a really important part of the conversation.
We have a question on Zoom for Jon Davis. The model used to create the Adirondack Park merged wilderness and private land coming into agreement about how to manage the land. Do you see that model being replicated anywhere else in the world?
Excellent question. Rocky, Jackie, Jenny, and fill in if I miss any possibilities here. I think that our model of conservation is a little bit similar in Adirondack Park, Northern New York, is a little bit similar to what is sometimes called countryside parks in England, where it's a mix of public and private land. But actually, I think part of what makes Adirondack Park remarkable is it has not been. It is actually a rather unusual model, if not unique. And I don't know any models like Adirondack Park on that scale anywhere else in the world. I think it's a model that should be tried in other areas, but I don't think it has been tried in many other areas. There are biosphere reserves around the world. Adirondack Park is actually part of an even larger biosphere reserve of about 9 or 10 million acres. It takes in all of Adirondack Park and all of the Lake Champlain watershed. There are biosphere reserves around the world, but it's an honorary designation. They do not come with regulations or laws or mandatory protection. It's just an honorary designation. But that might be a tool that could be grown into private-public partnerships for conservation. So an interesting way to explore increased protection in the future.
I'll get to you in one second. I just want to ask, you all mentioned like a bunch of the really cool carnivores that used to inhabit the New England area. I think you mentioned caribou, gray wolf, cougar, or was it the puma? Eastern cougar, elk, and even the American bison, I understand too. So what is it practical to see that return here in the near future? What's keeping us from having that happen?
Ronan, you go first.
I live in Montana. To the gentleman's question, maybe he left, but about Europe, I was in Italy a couple weeks ago, and it's amazing that there's a national park called the Abruzzo National Park that's just 50 miles outside of Rome, and they've always had brown bears, always had grizzlies, and always had wolves, and that gives me inspiration and hope around some of these more densely populated New England communities and states that it's possible outside of Rome. It should be possible outside of Montpelier and some of these other places. So I think it's totally possible to see that. It's just a matter of getting them on the ground, whether it's a reintroduction or if it's a natural recolonization.
So what's keeping that from happening?
Fear.
It is
Yeah,
largely fear. It is largely fear. So far, wildlife advocates have not been able to convince state wildlife agencies to back carnivore recovery. We will not be able to convince state wildlife agencies or the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to back the large carnivore recovery in our region until there's very strong social support. Joe Reset, a DEC biologist, told us at a meeting a decade ago, I know you're right about the need for large carnivore recovery, but there's no way. He actually came to a meeting against the wishes of his superiors. I think it's okay to say that because he's a bit tired now. And he told us, you have to force us to consider large carnivore reintroduction. Until you have massive social support, we're not moving on that.
It takes
So-
a majority of village to move that.
Yeah, so we need a lot of education, a lot of social support, and there has to be coexistence.
You had a question, then we'll go to you all.
So I wanted to make a comment. My name is John Kerr. I live over in Norwich. And I recently drove back from Yellowstone, 4,000 and some odd miles, 2,000 some, no, 4,000 and some odd miles, where I have post-retirement worked as a seasonal park ranger in Yellowstone. I have a small cabin in Silvergate, you know where that is, Ronan. And live there a couple of cabins away from Rick McIntyre, who's the #1 ground spotter of wolves in the world. I see and have seen in the past 20 years, and I've been a ranger there that long, post-retirement, the miracles of what's been preserved by the hard work and the dedication of people who put Yellowstone and other places that we know aside. And so my comment, which is just that, is to thank every one of you in this room and every one of you who's listening and watching for your energy and for your interest and for your generosity and for your contributions to show the wild and the wilderness. And also to thank you for your generosity if you've given it of land and effort and conviction and dedication. I suspect that each of you in this room, if we were able to take the time, each of you watching, would be quite distinguished in what you've done. It might be to set aside a small piece or a large piece or a critter that needs a voice for itself. And I myself have seen the effect of that. And it's taken the work usually of a lot of people. And I want to also say, finally, that this is a very difficult and challenging time for this particular cause. And it's going to take every single one who can do it to stand up for what we or you believe in, and for what the organizations who so well represent some of these causes and what the individuals like you, Ron, in this example, and lots of others do. So the bottom line of my comment is to say a grateful thank you.
Thank you. Sure. We'll take like 2 more questions or so, and then we'll be here so you can have one-on-ones as well for a while. We have somebody online.
Yes, we do. This is for Jon Leibowitz. Is there a chance the Northeast Wilderness Trust will expand to other parts of the country, since other regions would also benefit from a land trust focused on wilderness?
That is a great question. Something I think a lot about. So There are four, to my knowledge, four organizations in the land trust field that do the kind of work that Northeast Wilderness Trust does in the entire country. This is a very rare thing of applying with an exclusive focus of applying wilderness protection with the land trust model. And that's the Southern Plains Land Trust in Colorado, Kentucky Natural Lands in Kentucky, and the Wildlands Conservancy out in California, and the American Prairie Reserve. And so there are a few organizations that are doing this kind of work around the region, focused exclusively on rewilding and wilderness protection. But there is a need for more organizations like NUT. And I don't know if Northeast Wilderness Trust will one day lead that or not, but we often get questions from people around the country very similar to that. You know, I live in Alabama and no one's protecting lands as wilderness like you are, or in the Pacific Northwest. So I don't have a great answer, except that I think there is a need out there, and I hope more land trusts will, ones that exist, will start focusing on wilderness protection. And maybe ones that don't exist yet will be created like Nuke was 23 years ago for that exact purpose.
I was wondering if you all could speak briefly to the spiritual nature of wilderness. I think that for those of us that have been in this work for a long time, decades, we tend to focus on the transactional. We tend to focus on acres, criteria, mapping. And as someone who started my career in the early 90s as a wilderness ranger and really explored that out west, it's the spiritual components of wilderness that I think resonate the most and have, you know, the longest impact at an individual level and then larger. Ronan, I think your artwork and your pictures capture that, but I'm wondering if you could start speaking to that. And I know that both Johns have, you know, deep spiritual pieces to this too, but it's something that we often overlook in the discussions around how do you protect, where do you protect, why do you protect? And I was just wondering if you could touch on that.
Yeah, thanks for revisiting that. I think that, you know, there's a strong sense that I have that's new for me in kind of my adult life, is trying to understand what that means to have a spiritual connection to the natural world. I think that, you know, initially I didn't think that it would be available to somebody like myself, who's kind of a term orphaned culture human. Around my ancestry is Irish, some Scottish and German, and this idea that I'm just a white man, ancestor of colonizers, and that isn't available to me. And it absolutely is available, and it's been, for me, it had to be permissioned by friends who are indigenous and live in Montana and parts of the West. And there's an invitation by them, and Robin Kimmerer does this very beautifully in Braiding Sweetgrass, where it's this idea of how do we all remember that we are indigenous, have been indigenous to a place, and that perhaps a path forward can be to rekindle that wherever we live, in that sense of creating that spiritual connection to the natural world. Montana just passed, this is the first year that we celebrated it, Indigenous Peoples Day, and it's very specifically, very clearly, not just for what we traditionally label as Indigenous people, like the tribe that live in Montana. It is for everybody to celebrate their indigeneity, wherever that may be. There's a Martine Prechtel quote that came to me a few years ago around every person alive today, tribal or modern, primal or domesticated, has a soul that is original, natural, and above all, indigenous in one way or another. The indigenous soul of the modern person, however, is either banished to the far reaches of the dream world, or it's under direct attack from the modern mind. And the more we consciously remember our indigenous soul, the more we physically remember. And that idea of that we all come from some place, and land-based people is something that I think we can all remember that and rekindle that, and think about, you know, what is, like, we think of wilderness in its modern context, but what about places that are sacred? What about places where we enact ceremony on the land, not just in buildings and closed off from it? And I think that that's, to me, that's where conservation, that idea, becomes more long-lasting. You know, laws can fade, governments can come and go. This is the reality of our history as humans. And this idea of spiritual connection and culture and conservation from a rooted traditional cultural standpoint is something that can last for hundreds or not thousands of years.
Fine wisdom is good wisdom.
We'll do, one last question publicly and then, they'll be around for private questions if that works for you guys. Okay, go in the back there. Oh, both two.
The verb, oh,
One of you first and then the next one.
oh, the verb rewild, sounds active to me. Most of what I've heard today is the active work is protection. And the rest is pretty passive, except for the mention of dam removal. Would anybody care to tell me more about the active side of rewilding?
It certainly will in some cases and places involve actively restoring missing species, or should, in my opinion. Tom Butler has given a beautiful short definition of rewilding, helping nature heal. And often that will simply mean buying a piece of land, protecting, or getting it into the forest preserve, and then letting things be. That's the ideal. But in our region, again, we are missing some critically important species. Some of them may not be able to return on their own anytime soon, not in time to prevent our forests from being browsed to the ground, possibly. So I think active reintroduction does need to be considered. Rewilding often does involve active restoration.
Great question.
Yeah, I'll just add, so we employ two different terms. There's active rewilding and passive rewilding. And active rewilding can include anything from dam removals and culvert removals, like John was talking about, to predator carnivore reintroduction and other things like that. And so I think one of the beautiful things about rewilding, despite its name, it's not about going backwards. It's about a future path, and it's about letting nature heal, as John just said, and doing something profoundly hopeful for the future. But it comes in many different shapes and forms, and it is employed very differently all over the world. There's rewilding movements in Scotland and in Africa and in Australia and in North America, and it all is done a little bit differently. So tonight, at least for me, you heard about one specific tactic. We employ passive rewilding by buying land and then letting nature heal that way. But there's lots of different ways that this movement is taking its course in different areas of the world.
I'll just add to just the individual rewilding, that concept around like animism is a real thing, a real practice, a real essentially like a religion, one of the essentially the original one that humans have engaged with. So like speaking to the natural world is something that we don't do very often or have permission to do or feel that we are in the natural world. But going out, literally kneeling in front of a tree that has been there for 200 years and speaking to it in terms of sharing perhaps some of your deepest, darkest secrets is something that is an active thing that humans have done. It's healing. Fasting on the land for multiple days is something humans have done all over the world as a way to find clarity, to shift into a different mindset. These are things that are like individual human activities that we can do, or the seasonal shifts that happen. Having ceremony that marks that is something that we can actively do.
Last question.
Yeah, this is more in the nature of a comment that can knit together a couple of questions that were asked. And in my career in the land trust world, this touches on how do you know what is the right land to protect? And one of the things that didn't get mentioned, but I think is one of the more sophisticated examples of overlaying all these different values is the Vermont conservation design. So if people want to see something that's online, you can see how many different things are overlaid. But I go back to the very first question, is that at the very beginnings of the land trust movement, a lot of people came together as neighbors, and it's never going to be just driven by our maps and stuff. You never don't underestimate the power of neighbors getting together and saying, this is a place that we care about. And if you look at the whole broad sweep of this movement, there are so many places that were, oh, this is not important. One of the things I spent most of my time on in Vermont was rejected as a conservation site. It's now one of the premier conservation sites in Vermont. And so the technique that is not at the level of the land trust, it's not a level of permanence, but landowners can do reciprocal deed agreements, restrictions, whatever you want to call them. And they have legal standing as a neighborhood and are self-enforcing. And at some point in the future, that may become important enough that it'll get its permanent protection. So don't underestimate the activities of individuals in this world.
Thanks.
John, thank you. I just want to make one final comment, that it really is, thank you all for the questions, for your involvement, engagement, and we are all in this together. And there's a feeling in this room right now of community, of, collaboration, people like Adair and the Hanover Conservancy, all of you that have closeness to the land. We need to kind of work and act together and support each other and use the resources that are here, like John is saying. Private landowners can do this, and you can talk to your neighbors. We can begin to kind of continue this movement towards something that will certainly make a difference.
Yeah, I'd like to echo on that too. I think, action is the antidote for despair. And I've seen it happen down in Concord, where if you get on the phone and you communicate with these legislators, they get things done. They change their way, they change their perspective, because your voice matters to those people down there. And that's not just there, it's anywhere in the country too, including Washington. So yeah, don't think you can't be part of the solution. And I think it's been an inspiring hour and 15, 20 minutes with you all. And thank you for putting this together, Jon Donovan.